He rescued a giant Apache woman from the river. Right next, her father came with an unexpected reward. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's begin our story. It was late afternoon when the river's calm surface betrayed a danger unseen. A man, rugged from years of hard work on his ranch, was gathering his tools and preparing for a night under the stars when he heard the faint cries coming from the river. His name was John, a cowboy who had learned the hard way that peace and solitude were often fleeting. He lived alone on a small ranch at the edge of the mountains, a life of hard labor and little company, ever since the death of his parents many years ago. John had never quite gotten over the loss of his family, and since then, he kept to himself, working the land and living quietly, always looking for a way to forget the pain of the past. But that evening, the sound of a woman's cry pierced through his solitude. He had no idea what lay ahead. Moving quickly to the riverbank, John saw her. The woman was struggling against the strong current, her long hair whipping around her face, the water pulling at her clothes. She was a giant, unlike any woman John had ever seen. Her body, strong and imposing, seemed to clash with the delicate flow of the river, yet she was no match for the unforgiving current. Without thinking, John plunged into the water, his heart racing as he swam toward her. The force of the river was nearly too much for him, but the woman's desperate eyes urged him on. He reached her, grabbing her by the waist, and with every ounce of strength, pulled her to safety. She was unconscious when they reached the shore, her breathing shallow but steady. John laid her gently on the ground, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the strange, yet powerful figure before him. He had heard stories of the Apache people and their warriors, but never had he seen one so large, so fierce. The woman was not just any Apache. She was a force to be reckoned with, though she appeared to be completely vulnerable now. Hours passed, and just as John was preparing to leave her to rest, a group of riders appeared in the distance, their figures dark against the setting sun. They approached with purpose, the sound of hooves thundering across the quiet plains. John stood up, unsure of what to expect. As the riders drew nearer, the woman stirred. She opened her eyes, and without a word, began to stand. Her gaze locked with John's, and for a brief moment, he saw something there, a deep, unspoken recognition. The riders dismounted, and one of them stepped forward, an older man with a commanding presence. His eyes swept over John before landing on the woman, and with a single nod, he acknowledged her. It was clear that this man was someone important, someone whose words carried weight. The giant woman stood tall, her presence more commanding than ever, and the man spoke in a language John didn't understand. But the tone was clear. This was not just a simple rescue. The woman was more than she appeared, and John had unknowingly crossed into a world far beyond his understanding. The older man, the woman's father, finally turned to John. His words, though foreign, carried a weight that John could feel deep in his bones. "You saved her," the man said, his voice rough and deep. "For that, you will be rewarded." John looked at the woman, now standing tall and strong, her eyes full of gratitude. He didn't know what to expect, but he felt a sense of pride in knowing he had saved her life. But what came next would change everything. Her father, a leader of his people, had an unexpected reward for John, a gift that would bind their fates forever. What could it be? John didn't know yet, but he could sense that this was just the beginning of a much larger story. As the sun began to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley, John stood there, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. He had rescued the woman from the river, but he had no idea what he had just stepped into. The riders who had come to collect her were no ordinary travelers. They were Apache warriors, led by a man whose presence commanded respect. The woman, now standing tall and strong, looked different in the light of the setting sun. She was no longer just the victim of the river, but a powerful figure in her own right. John couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Her father, the leader of the Apache tribe, had given John a reward. But what did that mean for him? What kind of reward would a tribe offer to someone like him? A stranger, a cowboy, someone who had no ties to their world. The older man, the woman's father, stepped forward and placed a hand on John's shoulder. His grip was firm, yet there was a kindness in his eyes. "You saved my daughter's life," he said in a deep, gravelly voice. "For that, you will have our protection." John stood still, not fully understanding the significance of the words. Protection? What kind of protection could an Apache tribe offer him? He was just a cowboy, a rancher in the middle of nowhere. But as the man continued, John realized that this was not just a simple offer of gratitude. The Apache leader was offering something far more valuable, something that would change the course of John's life. "You are now part of our tribe," the man said, his voice carrying the weight of a centuries-old tradition. "And we will stand by you, just as you stood by my daughter." John's mind raced. How could he be part of their tribe? He had lived his entire life among cowboys, ranchers, and settlers. The Apache way was foreign to him. But there was something about the way the man spoke, the way his warriors stood silently in the background, that made John believe every word. He was being offered a bond, a connection that transcended bloodlines, a connection forged in the heat of battle and the depth of honor. John looked at the woman again. She met his gaze with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something deeper, something that made his heart skip a beat. She had been saved, yes, but there was something more to their encounter, something that was yet to be revealed. The woman's father spoke again, this time with a slight pause. "There are those who will try to take what you have," he warned, his tone hardening. "There are those who would see you fall. But with the Apache on your side, you will not fall. You will rise." John felt a chill run down his spine. He had no idea what kind of enemies he was about to face, but he knew one thing for sure. His life had just changed forever. He had always been a loner, a man who kept to himself, but now he was being drawn into something much larger. The Apache tribe, with all their power, all their history, had just taken an interest in him. The man's eyes softened as he spoke once more. "You have done something that few have ever done, earned the trust of the Apache. And for that, we owe you more than words." With that, he handed John a small, intricately carved stone. It was heavy in John's hand, and as he looked at it, he could feel its power. "This is the key to our alliance," the man explained. "Keep it close, and know that the Apache will always stand with you." John nodded, still processing everything that had just happened. The man turned to his warriors, who stood in silent formation. "It is time," he said simply. The woman, who had been standing silently at his side, looked at John one last time. Her eyes were filled with something he couldn't quite place, perhaps gratitude, perhaps something more. And as the warriors began to move, preparing to leave, John felt a new sense of purpose stir within him. He had just become part of something much bigger than himself. He didn't know where this path would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. His life was no longer his own. It was now intertwined with the fate of the Apache people. And no matter what came next, he would face it with them by his side. As days passed since John had saved the giant Apache woman, whom he learned was named Ayanna, the weight of his decision began to settle in. What had seemed like a simple act of kindness was now entwining him with the Apache people in a way he never expected. He had always been a lone cowboy, living life on his own terms, but now he found himself caught in a web of obligations, honor, and a debt he could never repay. Ayanna's father had offered him the protection of the Apache tribe, a bond that could not easily be severed. But John wasn't sure he was ready to embrace it fully. He spent most of his time on the ranch, tending to the land and his cattle, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Ayanna and the tribe. There was something about the way she had looked at him when their eyes first met that stuck with him. It was more than gratitude. It was a sense of connection, as if fate had woven their paths together in a way neither of them fully understood. One evening, as John was finishing his chores, he heard the familiar sound of hooves approaching. His first instinct was to reach for his rifle, but then he remembered the gift of protection the Apache had given him. He walked out to the front of his ranch, and there, riding toward him, was Ayanna. Her presence was imposing, her posture tall and strong as she guided her horse toward him. As she dismounted, John couldn't help but notice the way the setting sun cast a golden glow on her, making her appear even more powerful than he had remembered. "John," Ayanna said, her voice steady but not without warmth. "I came to check on you." John nodded, unsure of what to say. He had never been good with words, especially when it came to people like Ayanna, who seemed to carry the weight of so much more than he ever could. "I'm doing fine," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "The ranch is holding up, but I can't stop wondering why you've come." Ayanna smiled, but there was something more in her expression, something that hinted at the importance of her visit. "I need your help, John," she said, her voice now taking on a more serious tone. "There are enemies of the Apache moving through the mountains. They seek to take our land, to push us from the very places we've lived for generations. My father is preparing for battle, but we need someone who knows the land, someone who can help guide our warriors through the rough terrain." John's heart raced. He hadn't signed up for this. He was a rancher, not a soldier, not a warrior. But then he thought back to the promise he had made when he saved Ayanna. He had given his word, and he couldn't back down now. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the unease he felt in his gut. Ayanna's expression softened. "We need you to lead us, John. You know these mountains better than anyone. You know where the land is most vulnerable, where they might strike." John looked at her, his mind racing. This was no longer a simple offer of protection. This was a call to arms, a fight for survival. "I'm not a warrior, Ayanna," he said, his voice low. "I've spent my whole life staying out of fights, not seeking them out." Ayanna stepped closer, her eyes locking with his. "You don't have to be a warrior, John. You just have to do what you do best, guide us through the land you know so well. The Apache are skilled in battle, but the land is what makes the difference. Without you, we will be lost." John felt the weight of her words. This was no longer just about him or his ranch. This was about something larger, something that transcended his own desires. He thought of the Apache people, their strength, their history, and the honor they held so dear. And he thought of Ayanna, whose presence had already changed his life in ways he couldn't explain. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "All right," he said finally, his voice firm. "I'll help. I'll lead your warriors through the mountains." Ayanna's face softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you, John. You have no idea how much this means to my people." As she turned to leave, John watched her ride off into the distance, her figure growing smaller with every passing moment. He had made his decision. He had chosen to stand with the Apache, to fight for their survival, and in doing so, he had stepped into a world far beyond anything he had ever imagined. The battle was coming, and he would face it with them, side by side. As the days passed, John found himself working alongside Ayanna and her tribe, preparing for the inevitable battle that loomed on the horizon. The once quiet and solitary life he had known on his ranch now seemed like a distant memory. Each morning, as the sun began to rise, John would meet with the Apache warriors, studying the mountains and the surrounding land. He had become their guide, their eyes in the wilderness. The Apache warriors were skilled, their knowledge of combat unmatched, but John's expertise with the land gave them a crucial advantage. They were planning to strike first, to catch their enemies off guard, and John was at the heart of that plan. Ayanna, ever watchful, would ride beside him, her presence a reminder of everything at stake. Her gratitude was evident, but so was her resolve. She was no longer just the woman he had saved from the river. She had become a fierce leader, her loyalty to her people undeniable. The bond between them had only deepened over the past few days, but John remained unsure of where it would lead. As they gathered in a secluded area near the base of the mountains, John felt a growing sense of unease. The terrain here was treacherous, but it was also their only advantage. The enemy would not expect an attack from this direction. He surveyed the land, noting every rock, every ridge, every path. Ayanna approached him, her face set with determination. "The warriors are ready," she said, her voice low but firm. "They trust you, John. They are ready to follow you into battle." John nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. What if they're wrong? What if this plan isn't enough? Ayanna placed a hand on his arm, a gesture of reassurance. "You've already done more than we could have asked. The Apache have never forgotten a debt. You are one of us now, John, and we will fight with you, not against you." Her words were comforting, but they didn't ease the weight in his chest. The battle ahead wasn't just about survival. It was about preserving a way of life that had existed long before he had set foot in these lands. He had become part of something much larger than himself, and with that came an immense responsibility. As the sun dipped lower, the air grew colder, and the warriors gathered in silence. John stood with them, feeling the gravity of the moment. He wasn't a soldier, but he had made his choice. And now, he was about to lead a tribe of warriors into battle. The night before the attack, Ayanna found John sitting alone, gazing out over the mountains. She approached him quietly, her silhouette framed by the dimming light. "You've been quiet today," she said softly. "What's on your mind?" John turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I never imagined my life would come to this. I've been alone for so long, Ayanna. And now, I'm here, preparing to lead your people into battle. I don't know if I'm ready for this." Ayanna stepped closer, her presence grounding him. "You are more ready than you think. This is your destiny, John. And it's mine as well. We are tied together now, by fate, by blood, by honor." The words hit him hard. He had never believed in destiny, but in that moment, it felt real. The battle wasn't just about protecting the land. It was about protecting the people he had come to care for, people who had become his family in a way he had never expected. The next morning, the warriors began their trek into the mountains, their faces determined and their hearts filled with purpose. John led the way, his knowledge of the land guiding them through the rough terrain. The enemy would be close, but they were not prepared for the attack that was coming. As they neared the edge of the valley, John glanced over his shoulder at Ayanna. She was riding beside him, her eyes focused, her hand resting on the hilt of her blade. For the first time since he had met her, John felt a sense of peace. They were ready. The enemy would not stand a chance. The battle that followed was fierce, but John and the Apache warriors fought with a strength that came from deep within. The enemy had underestimated them, and by the time the dust settled, the Apache had secured victory. As the smoke cleared and the warriors returned to camp, John stood silently, watching Ayanna as she spoke with her father and the other leaders. She had earned their respect, and now she would lead her people to a new future. John felt a surge of pride. He had been part of something far greater than he had ever imagined. He had saved a life, but in the end, it was his life that had been changed forever. The victory had been swift and decisive. John stood at the edge of the camp, looking out over the quiet landscape that now felt like home in a way he had never expected. The Apache warriors, though battle-worn, were filled with pride and relief. They had defended their land, their people, and their way of life. As the last of the enemy soldiers were taken away, John felt a heavy weight lift from his chest. But the aftermath of the battle was not without its complications. Ayanna, who had fought fiercely beside him, now stood with her father, the Apache leader, discussing the next steps for their people. John watched her, amazed at how much she had transformed since the first time he had met her. She had been a woman in need of saving, but now she was a force to be reckoned with. Her strength, her leadership, and her unwavering loyalty to her people had earned her the respect of every warrior in the tribe. The battle had proven one thing to John. She was not just the woman he had rescued from the river. She was a leader, a protector, and someone he could not easily forget. As the days passed, John found himself spending more time with Ayanna. They rode together through the mountains, talking about the future, about the land they both loved, and about the challenges that lay ahead. There was a bond between them now, forged in battle, and it was undeniable. But John wasn't sure where this bond would lead. He had always been a loner, content with his solitary life. But now, with Ayanna at his side, he felt something stir within him, something he had long since buried. They spoke little of it, but the connection between them was palpable. One evening, as they sat around the campfire, John finally spoke what had been on his mind. "Ayanna," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "I don't know what's going to happen after all this. I've spent my life running from things, avoiding commitment. But after everything we've been through, I can't ignore what I feel anymore." Ayanna looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face, as if she could see the struggle within him. "You don't have to explain, John," she said softly. "I know." The simplicity of her words hit him harder than he expected. She understood. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to explain himself, to justify his actions or his feelings. They simply were. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with understanding. But as the days turned into weeks, John began to notice the changes that came with his new life among the Apache. He was no longer just a cowboy. He was now part of something much larger. He had a family in the Apache people, and Ayanna had become a central part of his world. They fought side by side, shared meals, and looked out for each other. But despite the peace they had fought for, the tension in the air was palpable. Their enemies were not easily deterred, and John knew that the victory they had won was only temporary. As the Apache tribe continued to rebuild, the shadow of conflict still loomed. One night, as John stood guard outside their camp, he heard the faintest sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to find Ayanna approaching, her face serious, her expression unreadable. "There's more trouble ahead, isn't there?" John asked, already knowing the answer. Ayanna nodded slowly. "There will always be trouble, John. It's part of life. But we will face it together, as we always have." Her words were a comfort, but the weight of the world seemed to press down on him. He had made his choice, and there was no going back now. As they walked back to the camp, John knew that the road ahead would not be easy. But with Ayanna by his side, and with the strength of the Apache warriors behind him, he was ready to face whatever came next. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: he was no longer alone. He had a purpose, and he had a place in the world. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The days that followed were filled with tension. John and Ayanna spent countless hours preparing for the next wave of threats that loomed over them. The Apache tribe, though victorious in their last battle, knew that their enemies would not stay down for long. Every evening, John found himself walking through the camp, watching the warriors sharpen their blades and strengthen their defenses. The quiet of the mountains now felt different. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Ayanna, always by his side, continued to lead with unwavering strength, but John could see the worry in her eyes. She knew. The war wasn't over. The enemy was gathering, and soon they would return, more determined than ever. As the full moon rose over the valley one night, John and Ayanna stood together by the fire. The crackling of the flames filled the silence as they watched the stars. There was something about the night sky that seemed to calm John, but tonight, it did little to ease the sense of dread in his chest. "We need to move," Ayanna said quietly, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but there was a steeliness in it that John had come to recognize. "The enemy is regrouping. They're getting closer. We can't wait for them to find us." John nodded. "I know, but where will we go? We can't keep running." Ayanna turned to him, her expression softening. "We won't be running. We'll face them, just as we always have. We have the land on our side, and with your knowledge, we can use it to our advantage." John felt a surge of pride at her words. They were in this together, and for the first time, he truly felt like part of something larger than himself. The Apache had become his family, and he would fight for them, for Ayanna, with everything he had. The next day, they gathered the warriors, preparing for the battle that was coming. John led them through the rugged terrain, showing them the paths that would give them the element of surprise. The mountain range provided natural fortifications, and with John's knowledge, they would be able to hold their ground against the enemy. But as they moved deeper into the mountains, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a stillness in the air, a strange quiet that seemed out of place. It was too quiet. As they reached a narrow pass, John signaled for the warriors to stop. His instincts were screaming at him. Something wasn't right. He motioned for Ayanna to come closer. "We need to move carefully. I don't like this." Ayanna's sharp eyes scanned the area. "I feel it too," she said, her voice steady. "Stay alert." Just as John was about to give the order to move forward, a distant sound reached his ears, faint at first, but growing louder. The sound of horses, dozens of them, thundering across the ground. The enemy was closer than they had thought. They had been ambushed. "Prepare for battle," John shouted, his voice carrying over the wind. The warriors quickly took their positions, but John could see the fear in their eyes. This was not a battle they had planned for. This was an attack, one that came too soon. As the enemy riders charged into the pass, John's heart raced. He had no choice but to trust his instincts. He grabbed his rifle, prepared to make his stand. But as the riders closed in, something unexpected happened. Ayanna, with a cry of fury, charged forward on horseback, her warriors following her lead. She was the first to meet the enemy, her sword raised high. John could see the fire in her eyes as she fought, cutting down enemies left and right. Her warriors, fierce and loyal, followed her with unwavering strength. John found himself caught in the chaos, but through it all, he saw Ayanna leading the charge, her presence like a beacon of hope. The battle raged on for what seemed like hours, but in the end, it was the Apache warriors who triumphed. The enemy, though numerous, had underestimated the strength and strategy of the Apache. John stood panting, his chest heaving as he looked around the battlefield. The warriors were gathering their dead, mourning their losses, but there was no time to rest. As Ayanna rode up to him, covered in dust and blood, she smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "We did it," she said, her voice breathless. John nodded, his own exhaustion weighing heavily on him. "We did." But as they looked out over the battlefield, they knew this victory was only temporary. The enemy would return, and when they did, the Apache would be ready. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. And John, standing beside Ayanna, was ready to face whatever came next. Weeks passed since the battle, and while the Apache warriors celebrated their victory, John could feel the tension in the air. The land, once peaceful and calm, had become a battlefield. The enemy, though pushed back for now, would not be so easily defeated. John had seen this before, the quiet before the storm. It was only a matter of time before they returned, and this time, they would come with more force, more fury. As he walked through the camp, John noticed Ayanna deep in conversation with her father, the leader of the Apache tribe. The weight of leadership was heavy on her shoulders, and she carried it with a quiet grace. She had earned the respect of her people, but John could see the strain in her eyes. She had always been strong, but now it was different. The responsibility of protecting her people, of guiding them through the storm that was coming, was taking its toll. As John approached, Ayanna turned to him, a slight smile crossing her face. "John," she said, her voice steady but tired, "I need you to help us prepare. We know they will come again, and this time, we need to be ready." John nodded. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when the Apache would need him to fight by their side once more. But there was something in Ayanna's eyes that made him pause. "What is it?" he asked. "What are you really worried about?" Ayanna hesitated, then spoke softly. "The enemy is gathering in the south, near the old pass. They have numbers, and they know the terrain. It's going to be a bloodbath if we don't act quickly." John could feel the weight of her words. This was not a battle they could afford to lose. The future of the Apache tribe was on the line. "We'll be ready," he said, his voice firm. "I know these mountains better than anyone. We'll use the land to our advantage." Ayanna looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I knew I could count on you." In the days that followed, John and the Apache warriors worked tirelessly to fortify their position. They moved quickly through the rugged terrain, setting up ambush points, hiding supplies, and preparing for the worst. John showed them the hidden paths, the secret routes through the mountains that would allow them to strike first, to catch the enemy off guard. As they worked, John couldn't help but notice the growing bond between him and Ayanna. It was unspoken, but undeniable. They had fought side by side, shared countless moments of silence, and now, they were preparing to face the enemy together once more. But John knew that this time, the stakes were higher. This was no longer just about survival. This was about protecting the land, the people, and the future of the Apache. As the day of battle drew nearer, the warriors gathered around the campfire, their faces grim but resolute. The air was thick with anticipation, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. John stood beside Ayanna, his heart pounding in his chest. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice steady. Ayanna nodded, her expression hard. "We have no choice. We fight, or we lose everything." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. John had fought battles before, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a fight for the future. As the Apache warriors mounted their horses and began their march toward the old pass, John felt a sense of pride swell within him. He had become part of something far larger than himself. He was not just a cowboy anymore. He was an Apache warrior, bound by honor, loyalty, and the will to protect those he loved. As they rode through the mountains, the air grew colder, the wind sharper. The sound of hooves echoed through the valley, a constant reminder of the battle that awaited them. John's mind raced, but his focus never wavered. This was his moment. This was their moment. They would fight together, and they would win. When they reached the pass, John's heart skipped a beat. The enemy was already there, waiting for them. It was a trap. The enemy had been waiting for them to come, to make the first move. But it didn't matter. John could feel the adrenaline surge through his veins. This was their land, and they would not give it up without a fight. As the enemy charged forward, the Apache warriors sprang into action. John led the charge, using the terrain to his advantage, guiding the warriors through the narrow pass and into the heart of the battle. The clash of swords, the sound of arrows cutting through the air, filled the valley. John fought with everything he had, side by side with Iona, her fierce determination fueling his own. Together, they fought like they had never fought before. The battle raged on, and as the dust settled, it was clear the Apache had won. The enemy, though numerous, had been no match for the strength, the strategy, and the unity of the Apache warriors. John stood at the center of the battlefield, his heart still racing. He had done it. They had done it. The land was theirs, and the Apache people had once again secured their future. The dust from the battle had barely settled when John stood at the edge of the battlefield, staring out over the land that had once again been claimed by the Apache. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the valley, and despite the victory, a heavy silence hung in the air. The Apache warriors, though victorious, were not celebrating. There were no cheers, no dancing around fires, just a quiet acknowledgement of the battle that had been fought and the lives that had been lost. John stood beside Iona, both of them watching the warriors as they began to gather the dead, both theirs and the enemy's. The cost of the victory was clear, but it was a price they had been willing to pay. As the last of the bodies were gathered, Iona turned to John, her face somber but resolute. "We have won," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of the moment. "But this war is far from over." John nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. He had known it from the beginning, that the battle they had just fought was only a small part of something much larger. The enemy would return, and they would be ready, but there would be more battles, more bloodshed, and more lives lost. "We'll fight," John said, his voice steady. "We'll protect this land, protect your people." Iona placed a hand on his arm, her grip firm but gentle. "You have already done more than I could have ever asked for, John. You have fought beside us, and you have earned your place among the Apache. But there is still much to do. The future of our people depends on what happens next." John looked into her eyes, seeing not just the leader of the Apache, but the woman who had fought beside him, who had become more than just a symbol of strength and courage. She had become his equal, his partner. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with resolve. Iona looked back at the horizon, her expression hardening. "Now we rebuild. We strengthen our defenses, we find new allies, and we prepare for the enemy's next move. We will not rest until we have secured a future for our people, a future where we no longer have to fight to survive." John nodded again, understanding the weight of her words. This was no longer just about the battle they had fought. It was about the long road ahead, the struggle to protect a way of life that had been under threat for generations. It was about ensuring that the Apache people could live in peace, free from fear and persecution. As the night began to fall, John and Iona walked back to the camp, the sounds of the warriors preparing for the future filling the air. The firelight flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the ground. John could feel the weight of everything they had accomplished, but he also knew that the real work was just beginning. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The Apache would need to stand strong, united, and ready for whatever came next. And John, standing beside Iona, knew that he would be with them, with her, every step of the way. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the bond between them, forged in battle and in trust, would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. As they stood together, watching the flames flicker in the night, John realized that he had found something he never expected: a home, a purpose, and a family in the Apache. And no matter what the future held, he would fight to protect them, to protect the land they loved, and to stand beside Iona, the woman who had become his partner in every sense of the word. The days turned into weeks, and the Apache tribe, under Iona's leadership, continued to rebuild. The battles had been fierce, but the spirit of the tribe was unbroken. John had found a place in their world, a place where he no longer felt like an outsider. His bond with Iona had only deepened, and they worked side by side, leading the tribe toward a future where they could live without constant fear of being pushed off their land. As the seasons changed, the world around them began to heal. The mountains, once echoing with the sounds of battle, now hummed with a quiet peace. The Apache people had not just survived, they had thrived. And John, once a lone cowboy with nothing but his cattle and the open range, had become an integral part of their community. The days were spent in peace, but the knowledge that the enemy could return at any time still loomed over them. They had to be vigilant, prepared for whatever threat came next. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, John stood beside Ayanna, overlooking the valley. The quiet between them was comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding that had grown between them over time. Ayanna turned to him, her eyes reflecting the colors of the sunset. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a trace of curiosity. John glanced at her, confused. "Miss what?" he asked. "The life you had before," Ayanna said, her gaze never leaving his. "The open land, the freedom. You were a cowboy once, John. A lone rider." John took a deep breath, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "I miss parts of it," he said finally. "The peace, the quiet. But I don't miss being alone. I don't miss the feeling of emptiness. That's what I had before. Empty days, empty nights." Ayanna's eyes softened as she looked at him. "And now?" she asked. John smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "Now, I have everything I need." Ayanna's smile matched his, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop, the weight of their journey together settling in. They had fought battles, faced loss, and rebuilt from the ashes. And through it all, they had found something they had both been searching for, each other. The bond between them had become unbreakable, a bond that went beyond words, beyond titles. They were partners, in every sense of the word. As the sun finally disappeared behind the mountains, John and Ayanna stood in silence, their hands brushing against each other, the only sound the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. There was still work to be done, still enemies to face. But for the first time in a long while, John felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. He had found his place in the world, and he was no longer alone. The future was uncertain, but together, he and Ayanna would face whatever challenges came their way. The Apache people would stand strong, united, and ready for whatever the world threw at them. And John, once just a cowboy wandering the open range, had found a new life, one filled with purpose, love, and a sense of belonging. As they turned and walked back to the camp, side by side, John knew that no matter what the future held, he had everything he needed. He had found a home. He had found a family. And most importantly, he had found Ayanna.